Hi, in this lesson, you'll learn how to create and access vectors. So what is a vector? A vector is a type of variable that can hold a list of values. While a variable such as an int can hold a single value, a vector can hold a list of values. While a vector is a type of variable, you still need to specify what type of variables are going into the vector. In this example, a vector of integers is created. As was mentioned earlier, a vector is a variable type that can store multiple values. But those values all need to be the same data type. In other words, you can't have a vector that has some strings and some integers. It has to be all strings or all integers. Also, vectors are dynamic. They can grow or shrink in size. We'll see more of that in an upcoming lesson. There are two ways to create vectors, either without or with initial values. To create a vector, you start using the vector keyword, and then inside of angle brackets, you put the variable type that corresponds to the variables that will be in the vector. Next, you give the vector a variable name, just like any other variable name that you would name it. Finally, if using them, you give the vector a list of initial values by enclosing those values inside of curly brackets. Vector values are accessed through their index value. So let's take a look at how index values work. You can picture your vector of score values as a table with the values in black and the index values in blue above the scores. Now the first thing you may notice is that the index values don't actually start at 1, they actually start at 0. This is very common in computer science and can be a little bit confusing at first. What this means is that the value at index 1 is 92, which is the second value in the list. The first value of 80 has an index value of 0. Along similar lines, the last index value in the table is 1 less than the size of the table. In this case, the table has 5 values with indices from 0 to 4. Now that you know a little bit about index values, let's take a look at how to access elements in a vector with these indices. There are two ways to access the elements in the vector. The first is using the .at command and passing the index value. For example, if you want to access the number 3 in the example vector, you will use the vector variable name coins and then add the .at with index 1. Remember, index 1 will access the second number in the vector. One thing to note is that if you pass an invalid index, you'll get an out-of-range error. For example, if you try to access an element at index 4, but the vector has only 3 values, you'll get an error. A second way to access a vector value is using the square brackets and enclosing the index value in those brackets. To do this, start with the vector name, and right next to it, inside square brackets, enter the index value. Both this way and the .at are equally accepted ways of accessing vector values. One difference, however, is that accessing an invalid index with the square bracket may throw an error, but it's likely to either pass no value or pass a garbage value that was left over in memory. Both .at and square brackets can also be used to update values within the vector. You simply use the expression to get the vector value and assign it to a new value which will override the value that was stored in that location in the vector. Similar to what you saw earlier, trying to update an index value that doesn't exist will produce an error. This example shows how square brackets can be used to complete the same task. Again, if you try to update a value that does not exist, you may be successful, however, it could produce an error. Now that you know a bit about vectors, let's use them in some programs. Okay, so we're going to look at how we can access vectors. And to do this, we're going to use two different vectors. So the first vector, we're creating it using initial values, so 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9, and it's an int vector. The second one is a string vector, and notice that we actually create 3 variables, and then we put those 3 variables in our vector in our initial values. Both of these work fine, and we're going to take a look at accessing them to check that out. So the first one, let's access using the .at command. So I'm going to say numbers.at, and if I say 1, remember that's going to be my first index value. My first index value is actually right here. So it starts at index value 0, that's index value 1, that's index value 2. So number at 1 should print out the number 3. So let's go ahead and run that. Okay, and there we get a 3. Okay, now remember, if I use number at and I have an invalid index, so for example, if I say number at 100, it's going to print that 1, then it's going to give me an error, or it's going to print that index 1, which is a 3, then it gives me that error that says no longer valid index. Okay, so I want to get rid of that line because that's not working. Now let's look at the second vector, and we access that vector using our square brackets. So we say cout, oops, this is going to be count, and we're going to say count at, let's go to 0 here. Okay, now if I run this, I'm going to still have the first number printing, and now I'm accessing my element at index 0, which is 0. Okay, now for this one, if I say give me index 100, let's see what happens. Okay, you can see there's actually an extra space there. It's easier to see if I throw another one in here afterwards, so count 1. There's a space there because there is no value there. It didn't give me an error though like the other one. Now it could give me an error. So most of the time it doesn't give you an error, but occasionally you do actually get an error there. So this way of accessing may not produce an error, but it's also not producing anything that's valid. So keep that in mind as you explore on your own.